The air is thin with frost and cordite. Somewhere just beyond the ridgeline, artillery pounds the earth into powdered stone. It is early morning, winter, and the world smells of smoke and wet wool. A young infantryman moves low through the churned mud, his breath a rhythm inside his helmet. Every sound feels louder than it should. The distant crack of rifles. The metallic scream of incoming steel. Then a sudden flash. A concussive punch against his chest, not loud, just final. He falls backward, the sky spinning above him in pale grey spirals. He waits for the pain that should come next. It never does. Seconds pass. Then more. No warmth spreading inside his body. No weakness in his limbs. No blood soaking through cloth. With hands that do not yet trust themselves, he reaches inside his coat. His fingers do not find a wound. They find a book. Thick. Split. Still warm to the touch. Inside its torn pages, buried deep within paper and ink, is a jagged piece of German shrapnel. And somewhere in the chaos of war, a life that should have ended keeps breathing. By the time that fragment of steel tore through frozen air toward one man's chest, the world had already been burning for years. Europe was no longer divided by borders alone, but by ideology, ambition, and fear. The Second World War, ignited in September 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland, had spread across the continent like a fast-moving fire. Nations fell not in years but in weeks. Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France. Armies that once seemed immovable collapsed under the weight of mechanized warfare and relentless air power. By 1941, the conflict had widened into a war without edges. In June, Hitler turned east and hurled over 3 million men into the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa. In December, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States was pulled into a global struggle it could no longer avoid. The war was no longer European. It was planetary. By 1943, when the Western Allies began to push back against German-held Europe, the battlefield had transformed into a maze of hedgerows, bombed cities, frozen rivers, and mountain ridges. Infantrymen no longer imagined war as lines drawn on maps. They experienced it through wet boots, empty stomachs, blistered hands, and nights broken open by bombardment. Tanks thundered forward. Aircraft screamed overhead. But it was the foot soldier who felt the war most intimately. He dug into foreign soil with borrowed hands. He bled into uniforms with unfamiliar flags. And more often than not, it was not a bullet that found him. It was metal without a name. Artillery replaced blades as the true reaper of the war. By some estimates, as many as 70% of all battlefield casualties in the Second World War were caused not by small arms fire but by shells, mortars, and explosive fragments. Steel did not need intent. It did not have to aim. It only had to fall. And when it did, it tore through canvas, through ordnance, through bone, through breath itself. Shrapnel was indiscriminate. It turned seconds into funerals and men into numbers. It came from nowhere and everywhere, hissing out of smoke and thunder, claiming bodies before they even knew they were marked. To survive under those skies was not a question of bravery alone. It was mathematics disguised as chance. One man might crawl through 3 days of shelling untouched. Another might be struck down in minutes during a quiet watch. There was no pattern soldiers could hold on to. And slowly, painfully, they learned that war was not about knowing when you would die, but knowing that you might. Every infantryman carried the weight of that knowledge in his pack. The American soldier carried roughly 60 pounds of equipment into combat: ammunition belts, rations, canteen, mess kit, gas mask, steel helmet. The German Wehrmacht soldier bore much the same, sometimes more. Everything had its place. Everything had its purpose. Some items were for killing. Others were for surviving. and some were carried for reasons no inventory list could explain. Photographs from the war show soldiers slipping small objects into pockets not meant for them. Worn photographs. Letters folded thin. Wedding rings tied inside canvas. Tiny crosses. Medallions. And for countless men across every front, something else. A book. Not for reading in battle, but for bearing. The Bible was not standard issue to any army as weaponry or armor, but among chaplains, churches, and families at home, the distribution of pocket-sized New Testaments became a quiet tradition of reassurance. A mother would slide one into a package from Iowa or Manchester or Lyon. A priest would press it into a hand before a night drop over enemy territory. A pastor would write a verse inside the front cover and send it toward a war zone like a final prayer in paper form. The book's presence was rarely discussed in barracks. Faith was personal. Silence often came easier, but in foxholes and ruined homes turned into makeshift shelters. You could find them just the same, tucked inside coats, sewn into jackets, passed quietly from hand to hand when the night grew loud. They were not carried for miracles. They were carried for meaning. Yet by war's end, stories began to circulate. Stories no battlefield manual could explain. Of cigarette cases bending bullets. Of belt buckles dented by death. Of metal canteens split apart by steel that should have entered flesh. And among those stories, one of a book. Small. Ordinary. And in one impossible moment stronger than shrapnel. It is here, in the machinery of global war, that one man steps forward not by choice, but by fate. And it is here, in the chaos of statistics and steel, that an object anyone could hold became something history would remember. Because the story was never really about the book. It was always about the man who carried it. By the middle years of the war, the pocket Bible had become as common in some units as extra socks, not because of regulation, but because of habit. Mothers tucked them into clothing seams before sons ever reached the front. Wives slipped them into rucksacks with the hope that faith might fill the space where their voices once were. Churches printed them thin, light, rectangular enough to rest over a heart. The war did not create this tradition, but it amplified it. When artillery could reach further than eyes, when death arrived without warning or heroism, men carried something that belonged to a world untouched by fire. For many soldiers, the book became more than scripture. It became a fragment of home, a reminder that something ancient and steady still existed beyond the screaming sky. Some read from it under lamps during brief lulls in fighting. Others carried it without ever opening its cover. It was not belief that every man needed. Sometimes it was simply weight. Something solid against the chest when everything else moved. The military itself never discouraged these items. Chaplain Corps existed in every major army. American, British, German, Soviet, each command structure understood what fear did to men in prolonged combat. Morale was not built solely with speeches and medals. It grew quietly in letters, rituals, and things men could touch when they were afraid. And when a man slid a pocket Bible inside his coat, no regulation told him not to. Yet what made the object remarkable was not its sentiment, it was its survival. The Second World War produced no shortage of relics. Helmets cracked by bullets. Rifles ripped apart by blast impact. Watches stopped at the moment of death. Entire aircraft frozen into cratered earth. But certain objects survived not merely as artifacts, they survived as witnesses. And among those witnesses were books. Paper should not stop steel. Any ballistics engineer will tell you that. A jagged iron fragment from an artillery shell travels with enough kinetic energy to pass through flesh, uniform, rib, lung, sometimes out the other side. Paper is not armor. Leather is not plate. Cloth does not resist fragmentation. The entire physics of mechanical warfare insists that a book in a coat pocket offers no protection beyond sentimental comfort. And yet, history insists otherwise. Across both world wars, museums quietly documented several cases where small personal items altered ballistic outcomes. A New Testament deflected a bullet in the Argonne forest in 1918. A metal cigarette case in Normandy fractured a casing. A prayer book in Italy absorbed a splinter from a mortar shell that would have ended a life. These were not common. But neither were they isolated. In war, nothing is truly impossible. It was during the Allied campaign in Western Europe in the final year of the war that this particular story unfolded. As American and British forces pushed inland following the Normandy landings, artillery duels became daily events. The hedgerows of France, once fields of wheat and stone farmhouses, turned into artillery battlegrounds. Visibility dropped. Shells did the speaking. For German gunners, hidden behind tree lines and rivers, firing was a matter of coordinates and instinct. For Allied infantry, survival was a matter of crouching low and moving fast. It was in this world of shattered villages and whispering skies that a young American soldier stepped into history without meaning to. His name was PVT. Robert L. Babson. He was not a general. He did not command a battalion. He did not change the course of the war. He simply tried to survive it. Babson had grown up on quiet soil. Church on Sundays. Fields in the afternoon. His mother had pressed something into his palm before he boarded the train east, bound for boot camp, then further, then across the ocean. It was small. Black leather cover. Gilt edges worn down by handling. A New Testament with his name written carefully inside the front page. No one in his unit knew much about it. Soldiers rarely announced personal objects. But in the slow hours before action, it sometimes came out. And when the shell hit, it wasn't in his hand. It was in his pocket. Years later, when historians and archivists tracked the story down from fading paper records, they did not find myth-building or embellishment. They found inventory logs, medical comments, a photograph of a book with a hole in its center and twisted metal still embedded inside the pages, a photograph that had not been staged, a story that had not been softened, an artifact that had not been exaggerated. The Bible had not merely deflected the fragment, it had swallowed it. The shrapnel had struck center mass. The book had been directly over his heart. And something almost impossible had happened, not once in 1,000 battles. Not in planning rooms or laboratories, but in one pocket, in one instant, on one shattered morning in France. The war did not stop. But death did. And from that moment on, the story no longer belonged to a man alone. It belonged to physics, faith, and a silence that no artillery could puncture. Because now the question was no longer whether he survived, it was how. There is no rehearsal for the moment when a man discovers he should be dead and isn't. Soldiers are trained to expect wounds. Even death becomes part of the language of war. But survival of this kind does not arrive like relief. It arrives like confusion. When PVT, Robert L. Babson, unbuttoned his coat and found no blood beneath his palm, the absence felt wrong. He had heard the strike. Mounted fear had already begun its descent through his nervous system. His body was waiting to give up warmth. It was waiting to collapse. Instead, it remained. Men around him were shouting. Dirt rained from the air like ash. The battle had not paused for his miracle. And yet inside his chest, something had fractured not bone, but certainty. Because in war, you do not expect gentleness from steel. When he realized what had happened, when he felt the thickness of the book under his trembling hand, it did not feel like salvation. It felt unreal. He would later say nothing dramatic. Survivors rarely do. There was no speech. No recorded prayer. There was just the small private knowledge that his heart had been in the exact place death had chosen and been refused. It is one thing to be told that life is fragile. It is another to feel that fragility saved by something soft and ordinary you once carried without thinking. From that instant forward, Babson was no longer moving through war blindly. He had looked directly at the place where his name should have been carved into statistics. And it wasn't there. Every breath after that carried weight. Every footstep felt borrowed. History often glorifies the men who fall. But rarely does it tell you what it costs to keep living when you were supposed to die. And for Babson, the burden would not come from wounds. It would come from wondering why he didn't have any. Shrapnel does not glide. It tears. Formed from irregular metal shards expelled at violent velocity, it obeys no clean trajectory. When artillery shells detonate, they fragment casing steel into lethal arcs capable of exceeding 2,000 feet per second. At that speed, human cartilage offers no resistance. Rib cages open like canvas. Organs rupture before nerves can warn. And paper? Paper should be meaningless. Ballistic tests confirm this. Layered books offer minimal stopping power against high-velocity fragments. But war does not operate under laboratory conditions. Shrapnel deforms. It tumbles. It spins off angle. Sometimes it arrives already weakened from ricochet or partial detonation. Sometimes it strikes sideways. Sometimes its energy bleeds away in air currents, tree branches, stone edges no one ever sees. And sometimes, impossibly, it hits something at precisely the wrong angle, at precisely the right moment, with just enough reduction in force to stall presence into pressure. The book didn't block the metal. It trapped it. Pages compressed. Lever bent. Energy dispersed through hundreds of thin surfaces. Not as armor, but as resistance. The shrapnel, already slowed, found density where it expected flesh. It burrowed deeper. But not deep enough. Ballistics is not faith. It is motion. And motion is unpredictable. The miracle does not live in the Bible's pages. It lives in the angle. That fragment of steel had already been wounded by physics before it ever reached Babson. It had spent its killing power on distance, interference, fragmentation. The book simply received what was left. And what remained was not enough. On paper, this should not have worked. But war does not fight on paper. It fights through chaos. And sometimes, chaos misses its mark. Survival does not always feel like winning. Often, it feels like standing in the place where something should be missing and realizing it's you. Soldiers who endure sudden near-death events speak of a shift that does not fade with time. Something loosens. Something inside detaches from fear. And something else grows heavy. Babson didn't speak openly about what the moment cost him. Most men didn't. War rewarded silence. But fellow soldiers would later recall subtle changes. He moved differently. Not dramatically. Just carefully. As though the world had begun to feel thinner around him. There is a term modern medicine would later assign to this. Post-traumatic survival response. Not trauma from harm, but from escape. The mind is forced to process not pain, but improbability. When existence pivots instantly, without reason, the brain searches for meaning even when none exists. Some cling to faith. Some cling to logic. Others to neither. For many, survival becomes heavier than injury. There is no visible wound to explain introspection. No scar to show for frailty. Only memory, and memory does not fade quietly. Babson lived. But the war never fully left him. Many who survive artillery strikes say they emerge from a different silence. Not absence of noise, but awareness that death chose them and then withdrew. And once that line is crossed, the war no longer belongs to maps or commands or orders. It becomes private. Every man around you becomes a question mark. Every calm pocket of air feels temporary. And someday, far from gunfire, you will still hear metal when a book falls from a shelf. Life continues. But not in straight lines. You live in echoes. You become cautious with laughter. And at night sometimes you wonder what kind of world returns a man after taking so many instead. News in a combat unit travels faster than fear, faster than orders, faster than reinforcements. And when PVT. Robert L. Babson opened his coat and showed what should not have existed, it did not remain his story alone. Men crowded close, not out of spectacle, but disbelief. A book split open. Pages pierced like cloth. A piece of twisted steel lodged inside worn paper, where a heart should have been. Commanding officers did not announce it. Medics did not classify it. But they leaned in. They touched the cover. They turned the pages carefully. Even in armies driven by regulation and routine, something quieter took hold. Hope. Not strategic hope. Not victory hope. Personal hope. For men living minute to minute, death is an invisible schedule. And when anything interrupts that schedule, it feels like permission. A license to believe that luck might not be finished yet. No officer issued a proclamation. But the story moved anyway. Between foxholes. Along convoy routes. Through mess halls under flickering lights. It was not exaggerated. It did not need to be. Abson's book stopped a piece of shell. That was all it took. Soldiers are not naive. They know bullets ignore prayer just as easily as swagger. But when war hands you evidence, not promise, it alters the room. The incident did not make men careless. It made them quiet. Officers reported no discipline issues. No fanaticism. What they saw instead was something harder to name. Men began carrying things slightly closer to their bodies. Photographs slid inside breast pockets. Letters pressed flat. Books moved inches left or right without explanation. No doctrine changed. But posture did. And sometimes the smallest shift is enough to carry 100 men through a night that would otherwise swallow them whole. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow that morning, a soldier in a German uniform performed a task he would never be remembered for loading, firing, measuring again. He did not see PVT. Robert L. Babson. He did not know his name. He did not know the book existed. To him, the shell was routine. Artillery crews lived inside repetition. They adjusted elevation. Set fuses. Calculated distance. Fired. Repeated. They were not hunters. They were operators of pressure and number. The war never showed them faces. Only coordinates. The fragment that struck Babson had no identity. It was not selected. It did not choose. It was expelled from a casing many meters away at the moment of explosion, flung outward, not with hatred, but with physics. The German gunner would never hear this story. He would never know his shell failed. Never imagine a fragment crashing into a book instead of a man. Never receive word that his calculation had been defeated by paper. War rarely gives closure. On one side, survival. On the other, ignorance of failure. It is one of history's quiet cruelties that the man who lived and the man who unknowingly spared him would never meet, not even in memory. One would carry steel in a book. The other would reload and fire again. The battlefield does not grant symmetry. It only grants consequences. And the story of this moment belongs only to one side because the other side was never told it existed. At the heart of every survival story lies a question no battlefield answers clearly. Was it chance? Was it God? Was it probability exhausted? Or was it simply that death blinked? Historians don't romanticize survival. They document it. And ballistics does not kneel to belief. But even within mechanical systems, within charts and diagrams and force coefficients, something remains unmeasurable. Why that angle? Why that moment? Why that pocket? War is not a moral event. It is an industrial one. It manufactures absence. It refines precision. It strips lives down to inventory. And yet, no matter how much data you stack against a miracle, something defies it. Some say the book saved him. Others say physics did. Abson himself never preached either. What he did was live. The human mind does not withstand randomness politely. If something as small as a Bible can stop death, then death itself becomes less stable, less certain. And that uncertainty frightens us as much as comfort does. Cadets are trained to expect structure. Soldiers are issued systems. Civilians read history books filled with percentage charts and casualty lists. But the battlefield? The battlefield is an uncooperative place. It does not obey narrative. It disrupts meaning. And once in a while, it returns a man who should never have walked away with nothing more than burnt pages in his pocket. That does not prove divinity. It does not disprove science. It proves only that war is not complete. It does not devour everyone. And in a conflict built to erase identity, sometimes survival itself becomes the loudest form of defiance. Not against armies, but against silence. The moment has now been seen from every side. All that remains is the second it happened. The barrage did not begin like thunder. It unfolded like tearing fabric. One shell split the morning open, then another, then three more, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with absence. PVT. Robert L. Babson and the men around him had already been pinned down for hours by small arms fire, but this was different. This was heavier. Closer. Artillery carries its own weather. A pressure that builds inside the chest before the sound arrives. Dirt sprayed the sky in violent arcs. Stone folded inward. And beneath it all, the steady, unkind drumbeat of shells walking steadily toward their position. Babson lay half-curled against the earth, his helmet askew, fingers digging instinctively into mud. The radio crackled and died. Someone shouted a warning that did not finish its sentence. When the next shell came in, it was not loud at first. It was close, and closeness changes sound. It arrived as a dull metallic cough that exploded the ground 10 meters away and sent debris screaming through the air like a flock of invisible birds. There was no time to think. Only impact. A blunt hammering force slammed into Babson's chest and knocked the breath out of him. His spine struck frozen dirt as if the ground itself had risen up to meet him. The world collapsed to colourless motion. Grey sky. Brown ground. A glimpse of boots moving past. Then nothing. Not darkness. Suspension. A strange quiet wrapped itself around his body like wool. He became aware of the cold on his fingers before he felt pain, and when pain did not follow, panic did. His lungs seized. His heart thundered violently against his ribs. He inhaled too much, too fast, choking on air that did not arrive easily. His hands moved without instruction. One slid under his coat automatically. Another pressed flat against his chest. He waited for warmth. Wetness. The sickening softness of torn flesh. But his fingers met only cloth. And something else. Thicker. Stiffer. Unfamiliar. Breathing sharpened. His pulse roared in his ears. With shaking hands, he tore his coat open just enough to feel. The book was there. It should not have been torn. But it was. Leather split. Pages crushed. A blackened edge burned inward through the center. And beneath his fingers, something cold. He pulled the book out slowly, as if it might scream. Lodged halfway through it deep enough to vanish into paper was a jagged, twisted shard of steel. It had struck perfectly. It had struck where his heart had been. Not to the right. Not to the left. Centre mass. And somehow impossibly the only thing it destroyed was a book. Around him, men were still shouting. The battle had not paused. Another shell detonated further down the line, flinging earth into the trees. A medic stumbled past him and did not look back. Babson sat there, staring at the impossible object in his hands, until another soldier slapped his helmet hard and shouted something he never heard. Because for a brief moment, the war had not taken him, and he had no idea why. It took longer than it should have for Babson to understand that he was not wounded. Shock makes liars of senses. The mind expects pain long before it arrives, and when it does not, confusion sharpens instead. He ran his hands across his ribs, his stomach, his arms again and again, as if the body might suddenly confess to damage if examined hard enough. He pressed his fingers into his uniform and waited for warmth. There was none. Only the lingering warmth of the book, still holding the memory of impact. Another blast rolled behind the line. The only thing that shook was the earth, not his body. He sat there, half sheltered by a fold in the ground, clutching the book like contraband. The cover had split open along the seam. Paper fanned outward where the shrapnel had torn through it. Each page bore the wound a tunnel burned straight through scripture. And in the heart of this ruined object sat the cause of it all. A fragment no larger than his thumb, twisted and sharp enough to unmake bone. He did not cry out. He did not laugh. He stared. One of the men beside him leaned over. Said nothing at first. Just pointed. Babson held the book up slightly, uncertain whether this was real or something only he could see. A second man looked. Then a third. The world seemed briefly distant, like sound heard through water. Someone whispered something that sounded like prayer. Someone else swore. The medic returned, kneeling beside Babson now with urgency where routine had been moments earlier. He opened the coat fully and examined the chest, confused by what he expected to find and didn't. His hands moved with professional speed anyway, probing ribs, listening to breathe, checking pulse, watching for blood that refused to appear. "Where did it hit?" the medic asked. Babson did not answer. He handed him the book. The medic did not know what to do with it. He frowned, rotated it slowly in his hands, then handed it back as if the object itself were fragile, not because of damage, but because of meaning. He said only one thing. "Keep that." And then the ambulance whistle cut through the morning and he was gone, pulled towards someone else more broken than Babson should have been. The world did not transform into revelation. It returned to bombardment. But something inside Babson had shifted permanently. He slid the book back into his coat pages, torn steel weight embedded, and forced himself to stand. His legs trembled, not from injury, but from a delayed flood of understanding. He was alive. The shell had made contact. The metal had reached his chest, and something thinner than skin had stopped it. He did not feel chosen. He felt spared. The difference would matter later. Because that wasn't the end of war. It was the end of an old version of himself. And as he moved forward with his unit once more, through smoke and fallen branches and shouting voices, every step felt too heavy for a man who should not have been able to take any at all. The war moved on. But PVT. Babson now carried something no one else could see from the outside. The weight of a life that had nearly ended, pressed between the pages of a book. In the days that followed, PVT. Robert L. Babson did what soldiers were trained to do after anything he kept moving. There was no ceremony for survival. No paperwork for improbability. His name did not reach headline type or command briefings. The war had no empty space for wonder. It required boots on roads and rifles forward and men returning to the line. Yet something quiet followed him. At night, in tents lit by dull lamps or inside barns stripped of livestock and turned into shelters, the story came up without invitation. Someone always asked. Someone always wanted to see it. Word had travelled too far to be forgotten, but not far enough to become myth. Babson did not retell the story with drama. He didn't need to. He simply reached into his coat or pack and produced the book. There it was. Still real. The jagged metal still embedded inside it like frozen lightning. Men touched it carefully. Some asked to hold it. Others stared and said nothing. In the long arithmetic of war, evidence mattered more than explanation. And that small, ruined book spoke without language. Chaplains requested to see it. One made a note. Another took a photograph. The story moved upward, inch by inch. Not as legend. Not as testimony. But as artifact. When medical officers logged Babson's status after the shelling, there was no special classification for not dead. Records noted proximity to explosion and absence of wound. No citation. No official explanation. Because on paper, none existed. War documentation does not account for wonder. But men do. For Babson, the battlefield began to feel angled. Like his life had been nudged sideways by impulse he could not see. He did not speak of visions. He did not claim divine interruption. But he checked his pulse more often than he used to. He noticed quiet things now, the sound of beans rattling in a can, the click of rifle bolts around him like a nervous clock. He noticed that some men around him had been laughing one moment and were gone the next. Survival does not make a soldier fearless. It magnifies awareness. He wrote home briefly. Carefully. He didn't describe shells or screaming. He did not burden his family with images that did not belong to them. But he mentioned the book. He wrote that it had saved his life. He did not explain how. He simply said that it was still with him, and that he would keep it as long as war allowed. When the war finally ended and uniforms were folded into civilian lives, Babson carried the book with him into peace as he once had into fire. It rested on shelves instead of inside coats. It gathered dust rather than carbon. He did not talk about it at community gatherings. He did not take it on speaking tours. The book did not turn him into public testimony. It turned him inward. Because once war gives you back your breath, everything else becomes quieter. And in that quiet, Babson learned what many survivors eventually do, that the hardest battle is not learning how to live through war. It is learning how to live after it lets you go. Long after the rifles were cleaned and returned to racks, long after uniforms ceased to smell of smoke and oil, the book remained exactly as war had left it. Time did not heal paper the way it heals men. The leather cover cracked with age. The pages yellowed. The burned edge blackened further in sunlight. But the wound never softened. The fragment of steel still sat where it had been flung, as though embedded in time rather than scripture. For years, it lived quietly. Not behind glass. Not under spotlights. Just inside drawers and boxes and shelves where memory was allowed to breathe instead of perform. Babson did not destroy it. He did not repair it. He understood intuitively that something altered loses its voice when restored. And so the book stayed as it was, broken, intact, damaged, true. Eventually, when caregivers of history came calling museum archivists, local historians, veteran associations, Babson allowed the book to leave his hands not out of pride, but protection. Not all survival stories endure mishandling, but this one demanded care. The Bible now rests where steel and silence share a case. It is no longer a private object. It is a witness. Visitors stand before it expecting something larger, something dramatic. Instead, they see a standard issue New Testament. small, plain, frayed, and only when they lean closer do they notice it. The hole that is not accidental. The indentation of impossible force. The pages torn inward from the outside. And inside it death itself, halted. Curators do not frame it as miracle. They catalogue it as anomaly. But everyone who sees it leaves with the same expression. Not curiosity. Recognition. Because the object does not demand belief. It demands imagination. It asks a simple question of every observer. What would it take for something you hold every day to one day hold you instead? Around the world, similar items exist. A wallet in the Imperial War Museum, deformed by bullet impact. A dented canteen in the National WW2 Museum. A helmet pierced clean through and displayed not as failure, but as survival. History has no obligation to comfort. But sometimes it does anyway. The Bible has become less about faith and more about fragility. Not the fragility of paper. The fragility of breath. The war produced tanks by the thousands. Bombers by the tens of thousands. Graves by the millions. But it also produced things like this, unexpected objects that refused to obey probability. This was not protection. It was interruption. Not design, but defiance. And long after the uniforms have faded from photographs, steel and paper will continue telling a story no voice ever could. Of a moment, when one life slipped through an open hand. War teaches the world how easily lives can disappear. It does not often teach how they remain. History prefers victory to survival, generals to infantry, strategy to breathe. But sometimes, the smallest stories carry the greatest weight. Not because they are grand, but because they are human. A book is not armor. Paper does not defeat steel. And yet, once, it did. Not by intention. Not by promise. But by presence. PVT. Robert L. Babson did not walk away from war believing he had been chosen. He walked away knowing he had been interrupted. There is a difference, and it matters. Because chosen whispers destiny. Spared speaks of silence. Of something unseen that lifted its hand when it should have closed its fist. The Bible did not stop the war. It did not save a city. It did not change tactics or timelines. But it rewrote one ending. And in a war that authored millions, that matters. Objects decay. Steel rusts. Paper thins. But memory does not rot so easily. The power of this story does not live in miracle or myth. It lives in proximity in the truth that death once stood as close to that heart as a jacket seam, and then stepped away. Not loudly. Not with meaning. Just quietly. And that, perhaps, is the hardest truth to carry. Because if one life can be saved by something so small, then every life lost becomes heavier. History keeps its battles. Museums keep their artifacts. But men like Babson carried something else entirely. The knowledge that sometimes survival arrives not wrapped in glory, but hidden between pages. And somewhere in that silence, life goes on.